Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1229th New Social Environment. I'm Magali, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Annie Bars, Charlotte Burns, Gaby Collins-Fernandez, Julia Halperin, Susan Unterberg, and Eleanor Heartney. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Annie Bars is a researcher living in Brooklyn. She works at the Mellon Foundation. Previously, she was a postdoctoral fellow at SMU DataArts. She has taught courses in literature, film, and cultural policy at the University of Texas at Austin and Columbia University. Her writing has been published in Lux Magazine, Public Books, ASAP Journal, and elsewhere. Charlotte Burns is a journalist and founder of Studio Burns and the co-founder of the Burns Halperin Report, the largest data study of its kind tracking representation in museums in the market. She is also the host and producer of the podcast, The Art World, What If, Hope and Dread, and in other words, for Schwartzman in New York. She has written for various publications. Gaby Collins-Fernandez is an artist living and working in New York City. She holds degrees from Dartmouth College and the Yale School of Art. Her work has been shown in the US and internationally. She is the founder and publisher of the annual magazine Precog and the co-editor of the Artist Run and Art and Music Initiative Bomb Pop-Up. Julia Halperin is an arts and culture journalist, editor, and co-founder of the Burns Halperin Report, the largest report of its kind tracking equity and representation in the art world. She contributes to several publications. She also serves as editor-at-large of Cultured magazine and a contributing editor to the art newspaper, where she writes a monthly column about changes and challenges in American art museums. Susan Unterberg is a New York-based photographer and the founder of Anonymous Was a Woman. She has had numerous one-person shows, been represented by 2 galleries, and now confines her practice to making artist books. She founded Anonymous Was a Woman 30 years ago in 1986 to give unrestricted grants to mid-career women artists. Since then, Anonymous Was a Woman has expanded and gives grants to environmental artists as well. And our host today, Eleanor Heartney, has been writing about art since 1981. She is a longtime contributor to Art in America, contributing editor to Art Press, editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail, and has written extensively on contemporary art issues for Art News, ArtNet, Art and Auction, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Her most recent book is the co-authored Mothers of Invention, The Feminist Roots of Contemporary Art. And with that, I will hand it over to Eleanor to get us started.
All right, thank you, Magali. So this is, I think, going to be a very interesting discussion today. Just to sort of set the frame here a little bit, as probably most of you who are watching know, Anonymous Was a Woman is a kind of amazing project that Susan Unterberg started. Was it 25 years ago or 30? It was 30 years ago, I guess.
30 years ago. We're on our 30th year.
Wow. Okay. And as kind of in honor of the kind of to celebrate this project, which has been for all these years giving grants to women artists. And one of the wonderful things about it is that they just sort of arrive. You don't apply for these grants, but you get them. And for much of the 30 years, actually, the founder, Susan, was also anonymous. But has recently sort of come out of the shadows to present, and to help to promote this project even further. And so what's happening right now is that this we're going to be talking about a statistical project that she has undertaken with the Burns Halperin Group. To look into how women really are working as artists and what it means to be a women artist today, and sort of digging deep into a lot of the details and the difficulties and the needs of women artists. And this report, which has just come out, it coincides also with a really wonderful show at the Gray Art Gallery that if you haven't seen, I urge everyone to go see, which also celebrates this amazing multi-year project. But I thought that before we get sort of deep into the discussion of the Halperin report, the Burns Halperin report, and the really very interesting statistical information that they've come up with, that Susan, you could talk a little bit about just why did you start Anonymous as a Woman, and why did you feel that it was important not only to do this exhibition at the Gray Art Gallery, but also to reach out to create this statistical database that we're going to be talking about today.
Sure. I'd love to just say briefly a few words about that. Anonymous was a woman, started in 1996 after the NEA stopped giving grants to individual artists in 1994. It was created to help mid-career female identifying artists over 40 years old we say they have to be at a critical junction in their careers, meaning they're still working. And as Eleanor said, she didn't say they have to be nominated, but we have a nomination process. So we ask lots of people who wouldn't have a vested interest in the outcome of nominating an artist. So they're museum people, curators, writers, people like that who nominate. And for the first 23 years of the award, I remained anonymous, preferring to keep the focus on artists rather than myself as the donor. And I'm an artist, and as a practicing artist, I also wanted to keep my own work separate. But in 2018, amid a wave of women speaking out publicly about abuses of power and inequity, I decided to go public because I wanted to be a more effective advocate to our recipients and for women in general. And the report that we're going to be speaking about today is part of that advocacy. We commissioned this report, which is we call the symposium Artists Speak, but it was a lengthy survey of so-called full-time artists answering questions that you'll hear more about today. I think there were 43 questions or so. So it took time, and we got a great response, which you'll also hear about. And in gathering and making this data publicly available, we're hopeful that it can be a tool for positive change and to share information so that working as a woman artist can become more sustainable. And what else can I say? We want to influence the decision-making of funders, museum boards, gallerists, and most important, to empower artists in their own organizing and activism. And the data is just a starting point. So basically, that's what it is. So I'll let you all take it from there.
Well, thank you, Susan. And yeah, it's I think going to be an invaluable sort of set of data for many, many people in the art world. I wanted to start by talking to Charlotte and Julia about the design. What was the methodology that you used? How did you choose, or how did you get to your respondents? And how did you decide what kinds of issues were the important ones that you needed to discuss?
First of all, we knew we wanted to ask the artists themselves, because when we were speaking with Susan and Gaby, very much at the forefront of what they were asking us when we were in a conversation about, if you were going to organize something, if you were going to organize some kind of gathering or talks program, Susan and Gaby really were focused on artist need, as Anonymous Was a Woman is so clearly and does such amazing work. And so we was thinking, well, we should ask artists. So then we thought, well, that would be a survey. And actually, the best person to bring into this is Annie, because we knew then that if we wanted to build a survey, Julia and I know how to gather and clean data through the Burns Halperin Report, but we've never built a survey before. But we have worked with SMU, and we know how brilliant they are. So we got in touch with them, and so that's where Annie entered the picture, and she helped. She really steered so much of the design and the structure and how we sent everything. So it's a brilliant question, and actually probably better directed to Annie.
Right, Annie. So, yeah, you want to sort of walk us through this a little bit?
Yeah, I can give us an overview. Yeah, I was really excited to work on this project with Charlotte, Julia, Susan, Gaby. And we really approach SMU DataArts as a research center at Southern Methodist University. And we really approach our work as collaborative. Like we have a lot of knowledge in how to design a survey that's easy for people to take and that we can analyze data from, but Charlotte, Julia, Gaby, Susan, they're the experts in what artists need and how to ask those questions. And so once we designed the survey, a big consideration was, well, how many responses do we need or can we expect? And initially, our goal was, I think, 100 or 150 responses. And largely because of Charlotte, Julia, Susan, Gaby, we ended up getting, I think, 1,600 responses from women artists. And I think what was important when we think about how we analyze the data was that we focus on understanding how different experiences and identities, like race, like income, age, location, affect the data. And so you'll see some of that. I think we'll probably talk about some of that. But I should also say, in terms of how the respondents received the survey was, it was really peer-to-peer. There was an initial list, and then respondents recruited other artists that they knew. This is called like a snowball sample. And we ended up with a really rich set, I think, of both quantitative data, but also qualitative responses. And you'll get to see some of those today.
Right. And we will, I think in a little bit, be looking at some of the charts that were created. And also, I think very interestingly in the report are actual quotations from some of the respondents, so that it's not just a collating of the data, but also, fleshing it out kind of from the voices of the artists, kind of what they felt about these various kinds of issues. I guess before we dig deep into it, I wanted to ask, and I'm kind of putting this out to any of you, what was the thing that most surprised you? What was the most surprising result that you found from, the survey and the data? And anyone can jump in here. Is there anything that particularly surprised you? In some ways, we kind of knew that women were facing a lot of these uphill battles, but anything that sort of really jumped out at you?
For me, there are so many. I think one sort of interesting, smaller point that is maybe at least at first counterintuitive, so I was surprised, was that we found that more than half of artists are selling art directly, so without an intermediary or a gallery. But the population that was doing it more than anyone else were older artists, so artists over 65. And so I think, we maybe I was expecting younger artists because they'd be more active on Instagram or, but we really saw that artists who had these deeper networks and potentially longer relationships, were leading the way in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, there were a number of interesting things because you divided the respondents, and you sort of cut them across different ways. So they were by age, by income, whether they were in America or outside of America, and you're slicing it in different ways. You get some very interesting kinds of responses. And you're right that sometimes unexpectedly, the older artists are. For one thing, I guess they seem to be much more comfortable in terms of, I remember remember, sort of studio space of the logistics of life, the precarity of the younger artists. But there were some questions that you asked that it was very interesting. Even going kind of across the board, questions about have you felt discrimination, or, what do you feel is the best age to be an artist? And there seemed to be, no consensus about that, which I thought was very interesting. But I guess let's take a look at some of the charts. Shall we let's jump forward here? So these are some of the kinds of questions and the kinds of data that were collected here. Questions about what needs there were, as you can see here, the different kinds of resources. And again, interestingly, museum and institutional support, maybe that is to be expected. But on the other hand, some of the other things that we might have thought were more important weren't, like formal education. It was interesting how that was not. And again, maybe you want to, was there anything in this particular data that you found particularly provocative?
I think we found it really, really shocking to some extent, how overwhelmingly women artists felt unsupported by the sort of art world or art industry as we journalists particularly write about it. There was, almost overwhelmingly a lack of consideration. These were factors hindering artists' career, not factors supporting artists' career. And, for institutional support to be 63%, that's, you can see on this chart, it really, our brilliant graphic designer Nahema Kariuki really conveys how high those numbers are. 59% gallery support. That's well over half of artists. The infrastructures that are designed to make them more visible, to bring their work to life, are more than half of the women artists we surveyed feel that they're not. And as we went through the data, there's so many different sections. As you said, there's lots of different questions. We sort of talked about them as facts and feelings, and how feelings become facts. And we thought it was really interesting to contrast this with the other chart, which is about the resources that women artists have most relied on, which are each other. And
Right.
so to think about how artists are making their careers and shaping their careers and sustaining them, it's not through institutional support, it's not through the gallery systems. For the majority of them, they're there. These are still, for 34% of artists, that's a crucial resource for galleries. But overwhelmingly, it's the community of other artists. And we thought that was really, really striking, that the sort of broader art industry has ceased to be relevant for the majority of artists that we surveyed.
Yeah, and one of the, I guess, questions that I wondered, is this different for male artists? And of course, that's not a thing that, this survey addresses, but it certainly sort of begs the question, what is the difference? And is there more institutional support for male artists than for female artists? And I know, it was interesting to me to think also about, you can kind of overlay, this survey with other surveys that have looked at for example, how many women artists are, get major shows, are in major galleries, etc. And a lot of those have showed us that, in fact, women artists, they kind of settle in at about, I think 25 or 30% of these major markers. So, I mean, I'm wondering if did you think about that? How do you, kind of, I guess, lay these statistics, with, in connection to other kinds of surveys that have been done, and how do we sort of cross-read them?
Annie and Gabby may have more to add on this, but certainly, thinking about it in the context of even the work that we've done in the Burns Halperin Report, where we see that, female artists make up 11% of museum acquisitions, and that the volume, peaked in 2019. You can, thinking about those kinds of structural and systemic and infrastructural things that are going to take decades to chip away at. Certainly, I think this is more of a immediate snapshot. But it's interesting. I was thinking about sort of how my experience working on this has settled with me. And part of what I enjoyed and found so enriching about it was that we weren't comparing women's experiences to men's experiences, or it wasn't a comparative survey, that it really was looking at, you know, female identifying artists as their own entity, and certainly, looking at distinctions and important contrasting experiences within that group, but that it was sort of embracing this group and not having to put it side by side with something else. Obviously, when you're thinking about like philanthropic strategy or like, bigger picture things, it will be important to put those side by side and consider them in, a broader context. But there was something about looking at this group as, as its own thing that I found really, really rewarding and nourishing.
But yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, that has not really been done. Generally it is done with that sort of more comparative way. But I mean, I guess I think comparatively. I was thinking also about sort of how women artists and sort of women who are not artists compare. And there's some interesting things here as well, in the sense that, the whole question about children, and women artists. Maybe we can jump to that chart. That how women artists are in a way much less likely to have children because, of course, of the difficulties. Or, there's some interesting income statistics too. And, for women who decide to become artists, I think often, the income is much less than it might be for women who aren't artists. So that's another thing too. Sort of what is it that you give up to become an artist? What are you willing to sacrifice? Seemed to be one of the things that was also kind of being underlined here. And I think also, there's what's interesting too is sort of these questions of how, I guess kind of how women feel, how comfortable, I guess, they feel within the art world and the larger world. And one of the questions that you also talked about was the whole question of censorship. And that was, I think, quite fascinating. And yeah, maybe we can jump to the censorship question. How do you read this? This is so interesting that so many artists and feel that there is a problem in the art world. This is about kind of whether they can speak freely in the art world. How did you kind of read that?
Wait, could we jump back really quickly to some of do y'all mind if we
Yeah,
spend
no, listen, that's
longer?
good. Good.
And Julia, Charlotte, and Annie, Susan, anyway, we all worked very collaboratively on this, which is, I think, one reason why you hear us all saying each other's names all the time. We're like, what do you think? But to the point of the statistics about women artists who are parents, which I think if you look at the report, I think 28% of women artists are parents, and that compares with something like 37% of women in the general population. So it's a substantial drop, but just so that folks here have that comparative. And also in relationship to income, one of the things we found was that not just that women artists were disadvantaged in relationship to things like national averages or the MIT living wage, the living wage calculator, but also, and this maybe ties into the question that you started us with, Eleanor, that the things that impact women artists are also things that impact women and people more broadly, right? That like, even though we're not looking at the statistics comparatively between like women artists and everyone else who's an artist or what men are doing in the art world, et cetera, that like the idea that women artists face like housing instability or like healthcare instability or something like this are also structural issues that address the population at large. So I think one of the things that was really interesting kind of as we move through this data was also how even focusing in on a specific population can show us broader trends in a general population that we sort of like know to be true intuitively, and also help us make the distinctions about this particular population, which are meaningful. So I think the censorship question is a really, really big, important one that was like top of mind for all of us as we saw the results come in, but I just wanted to not sort of move too quickly past
Right.
some of the other financials as we kind of got into all of that.
And I
Yeah.
think we need to mention, which we haven't, especially when we get into censorship, that the survey was completed the beginning of January, which of course was before Trump got elected. So whatever the statistics we were finding, I think right now, if there was a survey, they would be much more dire, and especially with censorship for sure. So I just think you need to know that.
Right. Well, and actually, yeah, you're right. Let's hold off on censorship for a minute because you're right. There's a lot of other interesting things to be discussed, and the question of support. How do people be supported? And so one of the sources of support in again we have some charts here. How much do women artists support themselves with sales? How much do they support themselves with art related things that are not sales, which would be, I guess, grants and residencies, things that that come from here, yeah, other art related income. And then we're kind of facing a situation now where many of those kinds of supports seem likely to evaporate, certainly those that are supported by the government. So, the kind of precarity does seem like it's going to become worse going here on. And unless there are somebody or some other institutions that can step forward and kind of make up the difference there. But yeah, it's very interesting here. This question too about how people support themselves, and you did cross-cut that also with race and with age, and there we found that there was a distinctive difference too, in that there seemed to be less precarity for I think for what is it, for some of the older artists and also for the white artists. So all of these kinds of larger sort of social issues and sociological kind of structures kind of also impact into this. So I'm yeah.
To what you're saying there, Eleanor, is echoing what Gabby said about the women artists are also, women in the world, like you said at the top of this, and you see those structural inequities through the data, especially when we start looking at the sort of fact of household income and how that breaks down. And we see that white women artists overwhelmingly have much more of a financial cushion. Essentially, they have more partner income, they have more family income, they have more access to real estate or other passive investments like stocks and shares. So it was really interesting to see that they're also, therefore less likely to work second jobs and, be juggling things in that way. Their debt's less likely to be unmanageable. So it's, you see, when we look at that and then we look at time, you think we thought a lot when doing this report, all of us, about who had the ability to, that's the chart you're pulling up now, who has the ability to who has the resources of time, who has the resources of money, and how that translates into who has access to studio space, who has access to the time to create art. And but there are things that unite artists. Overwhelmingly they're not making a living from their art. I think only 17% of artists are making a living from art sales. So they're having to find income elsewhere. But where that income is coming from is a patchwork quilt for everybody. But the materials in the quilt are very different depending on who you are, and what your background is and what your socioeconomic status is, what your age is, your location, and what your race is.
Right. And yeah, it was interesting too, the discussion about the mean versus the average in terms of the income, because in certain cases, if there were a few very, very successful artists at the top of that category, they skewed the whole thing upward. And when you take the mean, you realize that in fact, things are much more difficult than they appear to be than if you take the average income of or whatever in that particular category, which I found that very interesting too. And I guess in a way, it sort of reflects the inequities of, our society in general. Again, I mean, so much of this does do that. Well, let's move to the censorship, because I think the censorship question was very, very interesting. And I mean, very, I mean, it was surprised that I guess was maybe one of the things that surprised me the most, that so many people felt that they couldn't speak freely. And I'm wondering, how did you read that? How did you interpret that?
I mean, some of what was interesting to me was looking at this by age and looking at it by race, I think helps us interpret it a little bit. This was really pronounced among artists under 40, as you can see. So 63%, felt that they disagreed with the statement, "I can speak freely without career consequences." And it was also something that was really pronounced among artists of color. So 68% of Black artists, 61% of Asian respondents felt this way, and 45% of white respondents. And so I mean, again, it's something where you can see sort of who feels vulnerable in the art system, who feels like they have support to go out on a limb, and who feels like they have, a very thin margin of error. And I think it reveals a lot of the same and similar, structural inequities that we see revealed in other ways. But I think we also see the kind of the flip side of that, which I just wanted to add one kind of complementary data point, which is that similarly, pressure to make art based on identity is also more keenly felt among younger artists and artists of color. So when asked, whether they disagree or agree with the statement, "I feel pressure to make work based on my identity," those were similarly the groups that felt, more pressure in that area.
Yeah, I thought that also I found fascinating. And yeah, I guess putting those two together was to me one of the most surprising thing here, that there would be such a strong sense among, and you say particularly among younger artists, but really across the board, that these difficulties. We think of the art world as that this is the place where you go to express yourself. I mean, it seems to run counter, I guess. So I guess, what is all this telling us about the art world? I mean, it seems like it's telling us that the art world, a lot of things about the art world are not, what it purports to be. I mean, I'm just curious what you would have, what your conclusions are looking at all that in terms of the institutions. I think you talk about in some of the data that the institutions don't feel that there's much less of a problem with censorship, for example, than the individual artists do. Well, what is that telling us?
Yeah, I think that point is a great one, Eleanor. And to tie back to your question about other surveys, actually, at the time when we were completing this, there was a survey of museum directors by PEN America, the museum directors did feel like censorship is a pressure that they, as museum directors, are facing, but they have, I think, something like 90% of museums have no formal policy in place. So we see, I think, this again, disconnect between the needs of women artists and kind of the political reality that they're facing, and the ability of institutions to, kind of bolster them or protect them in some ways. And, maybe someone else might want to pick up on, but I think we saw, especially in the qualitative responses, a lot of interest in kind of new models and new ways of being in the art world, maybe more collectively, but also a frustration in that it's hard to give life to those, I guess, when there's so much precarity.
Yeah. Well, and actually that's another thing. Oh, but someone else would respond to that, but
Yeah, I was just going to sort of build on something that Annie was saying, which is also that, so as you mentioned at the beginning, you showed pictures of a symposium that we held on April 9th that had a public component where we discussed the results of the data. Julia, Charlotte, and Annie gave a presentation based on the charts that you're seeing now. And there were a number of panels with artists and then with some institutional people that discussed different aspects of the data. In the afternoon, we had some invitational breakout sessions where folks discuss some of the information. And in a lot of those conversations, one of the things that came up, I think, is also that like arts workers inside of institutions may feel similar pressures and may have similar relationships to this. Another meaningful survey to mention in this regard is the Museums Moving Forward survey. I know there's also been a lot of work with like Art Workers Coalition to gather data about the relationship of art workers to their institutions. So I think, it's like one of the limitations of this survey is that we're talking about artists, obviously, or people who were going to identify as, on paper as professional artists. But that like there's maybe a broader, and like we can't speak conclusively from this data, but there may be like some broader spaces of interest around like the people who make up institutions and the perception of institutions themselves or institutional leadership that there may be some tension around like who's being served, what values or ideas are being served, and like how maybe to your point, Eleanor, and to what some folks were saying, like what um where the art world is versus where like it thinks of itself as being or something like this, even though those are kind of unquantifiable, abstract formulations. Does that make sense? Julia, I feel like
Yeah, no, I mean, just to piggyback on what you were saying, I think, that something that's come out of this and that came out of the breakout conversations is the sort of potential cross group solidarity, both within the artists that responded to the survey, but also within different sectors of the art world. So, if we know that both artists and art workers, like on whose labor the entire art world relies, are both on average making, below the poverty level or below the living wage in their cities, that seems like a potential area for, cross group alliance, and also something that like really forces the entire sector to question the long-term sustainability of the people who are making it happen. So I think that's something that's come out of this that we've been thinking about a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the, I guess, issues that, yeah, the whole looking at all the data kind of raised for me is sort of the question of, in a way, kind of what do you mean by success in the art world? I mean, you're trying to come up with sort of, I guess, quantifiable ways of measuring that. So art sales, becomes one. In other surveys, it's been, numbers of exhibitions and all that stuff. But there's also, as I think one of you was just saying, that there seemed to be, and particularly in some of the responses, the qualitative responses, so it's sort of a hunger for a different way of relating to, the art world, relating to the world, that, and I'm thinking of, for example, community-based art or public art, there are other sorts of things that aren't measured by sales. They're measured kind of in a different way. And how do we, and so it really comes down to what do we mean by success? Is success, I think there were some of the responses talked about how, here I am, I've seemed to have, everything that everybody wants. Yeah, here, exactly. But I don't feel successful. What does it mean to be successful? And the data, and I guess the responses kind of beg that question.
This actually came up in the panel I moderated for the event that Gaby was mentioning, and I put this to one of the speakers, Karen Patterson, who's the director of Ruth Arts, which is a major philanthropy. It's very artist-led in the way it makes decisions. And I said, if artists are not gaining financial success, they're not having exhibitions, what is success if they're not making a living from art? And she just said very simply, to a round of applause from the room, which was filled with artists, success is being paid for your work. And it was really great that she said that, because ultimately artists need to make a living. They need to pay for their studio space. They need to do those things. And if only 70% of them are making a living from their art sales, then you have to look at like Julia was saying and Gabby was saying, I'm piggybacking off all their comments. Like Gabby did warn that we would, but we really begs the question of who can work in the art world, who can, success is having a career, success is being able to make art. And so in order to do that, you need to have access to the time and the space to do that. You need to be paid. And so these artists here on this slide are saying they're successful by most measures, but they're still hustling. They're still below the poverty line. So in that way, the art world has failed them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you sense in a lot of these comments, yeah, really a level of frustration, about, what does it mean to have an art career? And we do seem to be, we're sort of in a dangerous moment, kind of post, now that in the Trump world, where the whole notion of art, I mean, with the takeover of the Kennedy Center, et cetera, the whole notion of what art is supposed to do, at least from the, kind of the government's point of view, from the larger, institutional point of view, suddenly is being thrown up into question, and suddenly are we just going to be, is all the money for the NEA going to go to create realistic statues of American heroes? I mean, these kinds of questions. So I guess what's important about this survey is what do you see? What can we use this information to kind of press forward? To press against some of these currents that are, kind of closing in right now. I mean, how do we use this data in a way that's going to be helpful to artists? Anyone can jump in here.
I think that one of the things that we've been thinking about is just the fact that there are some challenges there are sort of, I think of like three buckets of challenges that this can help us think about. One is the challenges that face like all women in the world and creative workers in the world, wanting time, wanting to be paid for their labor. Those are going to be probably more addressed on like a systemic structural level. And then there are, the things that women artists specifically share. So like, those are concerns around censorship or studio space. This is something we haven't really talked about here, but just the financial anxiety and burden of studio space storage, especially for older artists, like long-term storage was an enormous concern, more than I expected. And materials, that's something that's, not all creative workers share that, but it is something that we found that women artists really across the board, across all of these different demographics really shared. So that's where maybe, directed philanthropy or directed institutional support could be helpful. Or, a lot of artists were like in some ways maybe a little bit more enthusiastic than I expected about sort of partnerships with real estate companies that especially like more artists in New York, for example, were satisfied with their studio setup than in other areas that we looked at. And I think in part that's because there is this sort of broader system of real estate partnerships, which have their own problems. But I was surprised to see that that was something that artists generally responded positively to. And then there are the kind of more hyper-specific like areas and intersections where really targeted efforts, I think, can address some of the burden. So, we see that for example, one example is like, respite services or mutual aid could be especially meaningful in Los Angeles, where artists reported spending more time caregiving than anywhere else. Or emergency grants might be especially beneficial for artists of color who find that, unforeseen circumstances were a much larger financial stressor than they were for white artists. So I think that there are kind of a ton of different ways and kind of your mileage can vary based on where you're operating to think about how we might apply the results.
Yeah. Well, one thing that was interesting to me also is that when go back to the very first chart, what it is that artists feel that they lack, or maybe it was the second chart, the one about what they need, that the thing that they want most is artistic community, which I thought was very interesting. Rather, it wasn't sort of, I mean, institutional support was the thing they lacked the most, but the thing that they felt most crucial was artistic community. So the sort of question of how do you create community, that there's it seems to be, that seems to be a very pressing question, and maybe one that, I don't know, maybe that's more in artists' own control.
I think sorry, Charlotte, go ahead. One thing, this is really quick, but sort of one thing to Julia's point, and it's worth sort of mentioning here that even given the really scary and chaotic changes that we're seeing in this new administrative world, one thing that was on the top of all of our minds as we were producing this data was that even if some of it was predictable or intuitive based on people's experience inside of the art world, because women are under-researched and artists are also under-researched, that having concrete data can be specifically helpful for advocating, which is one thing to keep in mind, and that like this is specifically gendered for reasons that are also predictable that many of y'all in the Zoom room probably have personal relationships to, right? Which is the idea that it's very gendered to believe that like women's reporting about their experiences is just a feeling, right, and not a fact, to Charlotte and Julia's earlier orientation. But I think, another thing around the question of community, and maybe your current question, Eleanor, is that on the one hand, like, yes, of course, like that is something that I think artists can do and do, right? Obviously on their own. But that there's also a different structural and financial pressure here, right? Which is to say that like it's very hard to make time for community if you have 3 jobs, right?
Right.
So that's another one of the features, right? Which is there's one part of the data which is like what are the things that can be done to address specific problems, and then there's another part of this, and maybe the fourth bucket or the fourth tack, which is what problems can be ameliorated, so that they get out of artists' way to just be with one another and make their work.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I remember there was one of the responses that you included in the report talked about that. It's like, yeah, how do yeah, sure, love to be doing all this community outreach, but how can I? With all of the responsibilities. And you talked, there's also charts about the kinds of responsibilities that artists have, that women artists have. And, it's the caregiving, the maintenance. I mean, there's so many things that sort of, it conflicts, so that in the end, I forget what it's actually a kind of what only 1/3 of their time is actually spent making art. I think was that it? Yeah, there it is. Yeah, only 1/3 of their time is spent making art. And yeah, so that it sometimes, yeah, you're right. It's, artists can create their own communities, but it's also, how in the current world that we live in do they make the time to do that? How can they, that's one reason perhaps why they have less children than the kind of larger population. These kinds of things. I mean, and I guess to me that was one of the surprising things too. That they only spent 1/3 of they were full-time artists, but they said that they could only spend about 1/3 of their time actually making art because there were so many other things that were conflicting with it. I don't know. Is that something that again is something that this survey could help to help us sort of rethink, I guess, what it means, and what artists need. What they need is time, I guess, is one of the things. And how do you provide that?
I think to Gaby's point, and just to follow on from what everyone else is saying, we see that gender bias is real. That's another thing that all of the artists have told us, that overwhelmingly, 68% said that gender discrimination had either a negative or strongly negative impact on their experiences. And a third said they'd experienced gender-based harassment, and a fifth had experienced sexual harassment. So we're, these are women in the world. They have time pressures, they have material pressures, they have, recognition pressures. And the survey, which is extremely in depth, goes through all of that. And it's very bracing reading. But the thing I think that's stood out to me as a sort of positive, we talked a lot about new models, and we looked at new models, and there's lots of specific ways in which the report could hopefully help. But, Susan and Gabby talked to us a lot when we were building this with Annie, that they really wanted it to be a tool, not only for philanthropists and museum directors and cultural leaders, but for artists, for anybody who felt that they wanted to have more information and know how to use it. So a museum director might read this differently than an artist might read this, depending on what stands out to them. But there is a lot of data in here, and hopefully if people are interested in it, then they can find something that they feel is compelling to them, and I know Julia and I found that when we did the panels, each of the speakers was really struck by different parts of the data, and they responded, to completely different things. So the thing that really did stand out across all of it, though, is that artists ultimately respect other artists, and they know how to create communities. And whether those communities are large, it's not like all women are one community that's moving together en masse. There are areas of real difference and distinction, but there are shared problems, and there are different communities within that we can see that artists are really really focusing on. So it seemed connected to us that at the end of the day, the thing that artists wanted most was more time with one another, because it's the thing that artists have said is most beneficial to them in their careers. And it sort of makes sense it's a validation, it's time, it's support, and it's things that aren't coming from other places. And also probably just interesting and fun.
I got personally a number of responses from people who had been at the roundtables and symposium. Couldn't we do more, gatherings like we did? I don't think we're equipped to do another one like this, but we're hoping that regional, there'll be regional gatherings for artists, and I think there's a real need to try to come up with some kind of solution, or there's power in numbers. We're seeing that politically today, when people go out and march and all, the government listens. So I think there has to be more opportunity for artists and others to get together and share, their gripes and their experiences.
I think to Charlotte's point and to what Susan's saying as well is that, this has been a really brief kind of overview of all of this, but that like in our approach and, as a tool, I think being able to approach this information as though difference of experience is real and also doesn't have to be a dividing wedge, right? That we can in fact listen to and learn from one another. And that should be a practice that all artists do with one another, but that can also be a practice tied to women artists, maybe histories of feminism, right? Even the practice of asking this many women artists like what their life is like as a kind of orientation is really important, and that we shouldn't be afraid of the ways in which we're different from one another, and to be able to use that. There's no one blanket solution to any of these problems, but I think, at least for me, and I think maybe in the conversations that we've all had together, like the process of learning more is actually quite inspiring on its own terms.
Yeah, and then sort of in following up on that, so, every time you do a study like this, in a way, it raises new questions. And I'm wondering if you were to do a follow-up, what questions are there questions that you would ask now based on what you learned from this survey?
I might ask some of the questions we asked in the panels in the roundtables, because we were really focused in the event and moving it from, we didn't want people who came to the event to feel passive. We wanted people to feel that they were active in this, that the solution is everybody's to find, because that's really what the artists were telling us too. And it seems that, that's what's happening. And so I think if we could bear to add more questions to the survey, Annie, then I think I would probably try and come up with, what would you do? Like something that would be more like, what would you do about the issues that you face? I think I might put something in there that was more directed towards self-action, because we can see that artists are so motivated. The majority of them are so motivated to think about these things and deal with them in different ways. So it
But
might
we
have,
did get answers from the roundtables.
yeah, but in the survey,
What
I might have put that in the survey. I
in the
might have,
survey itself? No, but I'm saying that we did get concrete answers.
oh
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. But I might have just in answer to the question, if there were different questions, if we did a follow-up, I might have brought, because those questions were so interesting in the roundtables, I might have brought them into the survey too, in some way, shape, or form.
Hmm. Yeah. So that, yeah, I mean, because what's great about the survey is that it's something you can disseminate, and it's there is all the data. Um, yeah. Well, I think actually we are reaching the hour point here, and I think that it's time to open it up to the audience. And I'm sure there's probably some interesting questions, as you've been saying, some very interesting questions that our listeners might have for us. So let's move to that.
Thank you all so much for such an enlightening conversation. We have a few audience questions. If you have a question for our guests today, there is a link in the chat where you can submit your question. The first question is from Michelle Jaffe. Michelle asks, the artists who responded to surveys are comprised of which type of artists? Painters, sculptors, mixed media, new media, as in digital media, and installation and or performance. How many artists using tech were interviewed?
Let me pull up the table. And see. So we had artists select all that apply, knowing that artists work across multiple media. So um, in terms of digital art, 10% of respondents said that their work includes digital art. Um, Painting was 41%, 38% work in multiple visual mediums, 27% work across different mediums. Sculpture was 36%. I won't read all of them to you, but a couple of other kind of interesting ones. Sound was 9%. Um, and printmaking was 15%, social practice was 18%. So a range for sure. And also, somewhat reflective, I think, of what we see out there in galleries and museums.
But also, the majority of responses were from older artists,
Hmm.
which, might skew some of that,
Totally.
might reflect those answers.
Actually, that's interesting because one of the things that I think, just to jump in, that appears in the data too is that there are these generational differences, and in certain ways, and you notice that in the report, you mentioned that, that some of the things that for the older women artists, some of them they feel more settled in their, just in their studio space, in their, kind of their circumstances of life, and that may not be available to younger artists. So there's a whole generational kind of question here too, that we can't really assume that what has been the case for, the older women artists will still be the case for the younger women artists because of, so many things that are changing.
Yeah, particularly around things like social security and pensions and tenured professorship. In a lot of the written responses, the older generation of artists was talking specifically about how important those things had been in creating some kind of financial stability or rent stabilized spaces or having access to studio spaces, from a young age, then, downtown, and managing to hold on to that for a long time. So when we look ahead, we see that a lot of those things just won't be available to younger artists. And actually, Julia did a great panel with artists of three different generations, and you could see that that shift had happened. You know, Judith Bernstein talked about real estate. Well, Julia, you tell it because you were running the panel.
Well, yeah, I mean, you got it. Judith Bernstein was talking about how she had this, she had a studio she still has in downtown New York. She paid $150 a month for it when she first moved there in the 60s or 70s. And then, yeah, you see the artists as the generations progress, sort of move further and further out, which is, like the journey of so many young people coming to the city, but Coco Fusco was, further out in Brooklyn, and Stephanie Jemison was even further out. Even though they all talked about how, investing in real estate and that they made that a priority and they were able to do that and that it was essential to their practices. But certainly, the precarity of teaching and having tenure and Social Security, all of those things, you really see how it goes from being sort of a central pillar of stability for artists to something that you just can't rely on.
So, and I guess that's another, in terms of using the data, thinking about how artists going forward can be supported, is to think about those kinds of issues. Yeah.
Thank you for the answers. There's a link in the chat that has the report. If anyone wants to be able to see the report in full, it is in the chat. The next question is from Jessica Siegel. Jessica asks, what can you say about change over the past decades from this report? I'm here as archivist editor for Judy Siegel, founding editor of the Women Artist News, launched in 1975 to report on just such inequalities in the feminist fight for recognition. What can you say about progress?
I feel like that's one for Susan.
I I don't know. I think we are seeing some progress. More women are getting some kind of recognition, but we have a long, long, long way to go. Women in the art world remains, parity in the art world for women remains, a dreamy, I think you said that once, a dreamy goal, but the field doesn't, that's not the reality. But I don't think that was her question. What are the changes? Can anyone answer that we've seen, the progress?
Anecdotally, some of I think, again, like it's hard to respond to it quantitatively because the data presents a snapshot of a specific period of time and a specific group of people, right? It's like, I think one thing that we're very conscious of in all of this is just that like this information is not like the capital T truth or something like this. Like it is one, again, it's a tool, it has its limitations, it's incredibly rich, but it's one set of information that hopefully can be built upon and used and, and whatever, analyzed in different ways. But I will say that anecdotally, both in the afternoon conversation and in the mornings, I don't think anyone was particularly surprised by the inequities that were presented. And if anything, people were like, I thought it was worse. So I think maybe that's like a kind of backwards way of saying that perceptually, at least, progress is being made, right? In the sense that folks feared that that statistically things would represent more inequity. And in fact, there was more access than people thought there might be.
The one other thing I would add, I mean, again, as everyone else has said, the reports of progress are going to be anecdotal because we were looking just at, a really defined kind of present to the previous year when we asked these questions. But I think one thing that I thought about in the conversations I had with my artist panelists was that, Judith Bernstein talked about how it's only in the last 10 years that she'd had any kind of sustained commercial support for her work and any kind of gallery that was really invested in her. And Coco Fusco, it happened, slightly earlier in her career, but she still had been working for 20, 30 years, in really at a really high level before she had, serious gallery support that she felt like was sort of matching the level that she was working at. And then we see someone like Stephanie, who is a bit younger and has had gallery support, earlier on in her career and has felt that sort of more consistently. And from an earlier stage. So, I mean, those are three people, and we see more broadly that artists are not feeling that kind of support from galleries writ large. But I think, just looking at those three as anecdotal, and the fact that the support has started earlier on as the artists get younger, to me that was a bit encouraging.
This show that we have that was mentioned in conjunction with this, looking at the past, the first 25 years of Anonymous, was a woman at the Gray Art Museum. There are, 251 artists in that 25-year period received grants from Anonymous. And the show only has, I think, 42 artists in it. And only half of those have any kind of gallery support, which I think is indicative still of artists' work has changed. It's larger in some respects. It's a different kind of work we're seeing that galleries can't sell. It's installations and sound and art like that.
I think
Which I think is why it's important, that there be these other sources of support, the question isn't just about sales, it's those other sources of support, and how can they be cultivated? Because you're right, a lot of work that's done today is not saleable, and the art market, which I guess the art market sort of looms over this whole thing, but you don't directly address it, but it looms kind of over all of these questions, and you want that to be the ultimate arbiter, and so you need to have these other sources, and how do you make that happen? But go ahead, Gabby, you wanted to say something.
Oh, it was sort of in keeping with what you brought up, Eleanor, which is just that, like, to Julia's point about gallery support and the way that even anecdotally in some of the responses that we looked at earlier, like the idea of what it's like to be doing well in your career and whether or not that aligns with financial stability, right? Which is again a different kind of measure is relevant. And like, I know it's an overused framework for all of these things, but it's like, what are the elements that contribute to a sustainable life as an artist, right? And I think one way of interpreting or understanding this question about artist community is that like in scenarios where various things feel precarious, the interpersonal supports that are generated create a kind of sustainability that isn't present in other ways. And like, I think that those things, if everybody was making enough money, I think that people would still need community, right? That's not an issue. That's not the question here, but that like, I think that there are a couple of questions that stick out to me as I think about the report over time, which is just what things match up, what things don't match up, and I think maybe most importantly, like not assuming that artists who look like they're doing well are quote unquote fine, or vice versa, right? That we actually could be doing a little bit more to assume that structural instability is the norm and not the exception for everybody.
I would add to that, and I agree. I think structural instability is the norm, and I'm not sure that, I think there are some institutions that are going to use this as a rallying cry, and there are some galleries that will, but the market's in a much tougher spot than it has been in years, and so there's mostly a retreat from the market. So the market doesn't seem like it's coming to save anyone. So it's what I found more interesting was that the panelists on Julia's panel particularly talked about, and in our roundtables, people talked about understanding that they couldn't rely on the art world, or even if they had success in the art world, it's not a career where you're going from success to success. You're not going up a career ladder and reaching CEO level at some point, and then you're going to have some bigger salary. You may have a period of success and demand, and then you may go out of demand, and then you may come back in. And so the artist talked about the strategies they had developed to buy themselves the time and space. And whether that was real estate, whether that was other jobs, and mostly it was real estate, mostly it was investing in property so that they could um, do that. And so I think if there are funders out there, which there are, the thing that artists seem to want was unrestricted grants so that they could, put a deposit on a house and use that as some kind of security to get them through the leaner times, or just to have that security, which is something Stephanie Jameson talked about in her panel with Julia. And I know a lot more philanthropies are thinking of doing these days that, project-based funding is not necessarily supporting the artist's entire career. So that was really interesting to me, hear about the strategies that artists have had for creating their own support networks, knowing that even if they're successful, they're not going to be successful for a 50-year run.
And what I've done with Anonymous is just one example of helping artists through philanthropy and unrestricted grants. But we need much more, even if it's small, of that kind of support. And I don't know, we're always open, Gaby and I, to tell people how we do it and to help them, devise their own way. And but that's just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, but an important drop. I mean, you never know when a drop will spread.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And the more people who know about Anonymous, which of course the symposium helped, the more they might think of ways they too can be helpful with unrestricted, money.
Yeah, it's something that Susan and I laugh about and think about seriously. We laugh in a serious way about in terms of Anonymous is how I think Susan, I don't want to speak for you, but you kind of don't love being thought of as a philanthropist, right? And in some ways, I think another way of thinking about the values that are reported in the report is Susan, Anonymous was something that Susan started because she identified a community need largely because of residencies and in conversation with other artists, right? That there was this feature of women artists in mid-career who were in the sandwich generation, whose time was being drained by external factors and who were also experiencing gender discrimination in the art world, right? And that this was a group of people who could use the support that she had available. But that in this sense, Anonymous is better thought of as a gesture toward creating community support than it is a philanthropic project, right? In the sense that it comes from a it comes from the assessment of what is needed and it redistributes based on letting folks use unrestricted grants. Anyway,
It's because I'm an artist. If I was just a philanthropist, I think it would be very different. And through Anonymous, we're very personal. We have Zooms for our newest recipients. We had a picnic where we might do that again. We've really been trying for community even before the symposium happened.
And actually, Susan, I'm curious. So now you've had, this big anniversary. So plan is just to continue on, or do you
continue? That was the first 25 years. We're in our 30th year. So the artists 4 years since haven't, they're not part of this. So yes, we're continuing on. We do environmental. We're always looking, for a new way to help. And we so far, I don't know where that will lead us, but it might be immigration. It might be formerly incarcerated women artists. It could be a lot of things. And I have older, some of them are in their 30s, early 30s grandchildren who want to be part of all of this, and they'll take it over. someday. So their ideas are much appreciated. Gaby and I are going to meet with my granddaughter next week and discuss, and I know she's for it. I know Gaby's for it. Now I'm for it. Should we include women who, become trans men, and they need the support too. So we're always looking for different ways of helping, but it's still small in terms of the whole art world and women.
Yeah, Anonymous Was a Woman is like the people on this. It's me and Susan, like in collaboration with some
Period.
people on the screen. And like we work with Lorraine Helvig, who's an opera singer and helps us administrate. But I guess maybe to answer your question, Eleanor, we're like in a scheming phase.
Which is
Right.
great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you learn from all this, as you say, and all in the symposium and the responses will maybe send things in new directions also.
This money came from after my father died. My inheritance was half of his foundation. I had a sister, and our interests were totally different. And since I never wanted to be a philanthropist, I didn't spend my money, and so it's grown, and that's why we're able to do more now than we would have had I been spending it all along.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. Do we have more questions?
There is one more question from Babs Ringgold, and I know some of y'all started touching on this in the previous question. Babs asks, did you notice asks that women between the ages of 60 to 70 in particular have the least amount of notice/recognition in the art world, making art for 35 to 40 years with some success, but with a lingering feeling of being in no man's land? Institutions and galleries seem to be looking for the next hot young woman or the old woman over 75 that has not received their due. I'm not referring to monetary success, but recognition.
Well, we chose from the beginning to give to that group of it's not only that 10 years, but for the same reason that she's addressing, that the very younger ones get picked up often, and older ones, but middle age is defined by our panelists, and last year it was pretty old, so it depends if artists are still making work. But there were, I think, 3 in their 80s who received the award last year.
I think like this question asks it's a really important personal reflection on something that this is sort of like, this is anecdotal over here. I don't know that Susan co-signs this opinion, but like,
we're just different generations, so we do have different opinions.
But that like, what this person is describing as like that particular gap of time, or what happens between when part of your value comes from being young versus when part of your value was like having survived so long without recognition, is that like the mid-career period is crucial so that you don't have as many examples of like artists in their 80s who somehow survived being overlooked for 80 years and also stayed alive. Like with these perfectly like intact careers that that people can just sort of like display. And like there's a part of me that's a conspiracy theorist that believes that like part of the gendered element of this is that it's easier to overlook women in this period of time because we like finding them when they're older, right? We like seeing the career arc that's already wrapped up without the possibility for them to like change and grow and like make different kinds of trouble. So I just want to like, I think that's something which is important about, I mean, it's something that we see in applications every year. So Eleanor, this was something from the beginning, but it used to be that artists didn't apply, they were just chosen, but now they're nominated and submit their applications because that way they can control the work that we're reviewing every year, which I think is to their benefit, even though it's a little bit of labor.
Yeah, the nominators in the beginning didn't tell the artists didn't know they were nominated, and
Yeah.
so won, and they just went and picked slides. But anyway.
And I wonder what like Julia, Charlotte, and Annie might say to reflect this, but I think part of all the work that we're doing that motivates this is the idea that like that gap is ultimately detrimental because also women at mid-career are at like the height of their powers as artists. And so like that is the moment when they should be receiving the most resources to make exciting new work.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I find that in my work as a journalist, you know, the artists that I have taken the most pleasure in writing about are artists in mid-career, you know, who are between the ages of like 40 and 65. Often because when I'm writing about them, they haven't had a major profile in a lot of cases, even though they have an incredible track record of work. And their work becomes about kind of like reveling in the mastery that they've developed. And it's you know, just as a journalist and as a storyteller, it's like to me the most fascinating moment in the career to be looking. Um, but yeah, I pulled up because I had the spreadsheet up. I was just looking at, you know, I mean, it's actually interesting. So in media, in terms of artists who had received international media coverage, in the previous 5 years that we talked to, artists under 40, it was 30% of those surveyed. Artists 40 to 64, it was 34%. And artists 65 and over were actually the lowest, at 25%. But in a way that has tracked with some of Charlotte and our research, which is that like for women artists, it's good to be old for attention, but it's even better to be dead. So anything we can do to shift that, I think is a good thing.
Right. All right. Well, that may be a wonderful way to end this talk. Okay. So thank you. Thank you all. So,
Thank you all so
Everyone.
much. Thank
Thank you
you,
for having us.
of course. Thank you, Annie, Charlotte, Gabby, Julia, Susan, and Eleanor. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSC program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Dean D'Derco and Joey Tang and a reading by K. Curtis Lyle on the event of Like Water on view at Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. And as Israel tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Hello,
thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for
It was
attending.
great. Thank you.
Gabby.
Have a good
Great.
one.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Thanks, Gabby.
you.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Bye. Have a good day.
Okay.